Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 2022 gubernatorial races for this fall's midterm elections. Now, a couple of days ago, I released my Senate prediction for the month of April. Now we're going to be doing the gubernatorial predictions as well. We'll probably be trying to do these at least once a month up until the midterm elections. So, as you'll notice right away, there's a lot more safe red states than we had on the Senate level, and of course there's a lot less safe blue states on the gubernatorial level. That's mainly because these governor's races tend to be more competitive than federal races like Senate races. So you'll have states like Illinois, for instance, which I put safe for the Senate race for the Democrats. I do not have marked safe on this map, and there's a couple other states that aren't yet marked that I want to talk about. For instance, Connecticut is a maybe. It really just depends on the current governor's approval ratings. That's a race that could possibly be super competitive, or it might not be. We'll have to see as we get closer to election season. But we're going to get started. We're going to start from the West Coast to the East, as we always do with the state of Oregon. Now, there's been a lot of interesting polls coming out of Oregon, and I'm a bit skeptical of them, but there's an overall trend that I think is very apparent, and that is that Democrats are in a lot of trouble in the state of Oregon. I don't know if the polls will be up here. They are. The latest polls, and these came out in February, and there's some other polls as well that have very low approval ratings for both Biden and Kate Brown. I do wonder if there's a sampling bias there, because I think Kate Brown's disapproval was like 72%, which I think is a little bit hard to believe. Joe Biden's was like 66, which again, he might be unpopular, but I think that's a really astronomical number considering it's not even that low in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona. So I find that a little bit hard to believe, although I definitely think that Joe Biden is probably underwater in the state of Oregon, as he is in most states. Oregon tends to have pretty competitive gubernatorial races. We can go back to 2018, which was considered a blue wave year, in which Kate Brown was never super popular. She only won her election with 50.1% of the vote, and the Republican got nearly 44%. Again, nearly a 6-point difference in a, D+7, D+8 environment in which Democrats had the turnout advantage, they had the enthusiasm, and yet this race still was within single digits. I have no doubt that that'll be the case again. Kate Brown, obviously, she is term limited, but the Democratic nominee is still uncertain. We also have a third-party challenger in Betsy Johnson, who might play as sort of a spoiler for the Democrats, as I could see some, maybe like a quarter of Dems or so, supporting her, and maybe some Republicans. She's been called the Joe Manchin of Oregon. She stalled a lot of more of the far-left progressive legislation that otherwise would have been passed had she not been in the state Senate. But as I think right now, I still think the Democrats will have an edge in this race, but I'm going to keep it as lean as I've done in these previous elections predictions until I get more polling and more evidence out of Oregon, because we really don't have a lot to go on. I'm putting it as lean based on the precedent that, Oregon's been very competitive for the last decade or so on the governor's level, a little bit more. And obviously, if the polls are slanting in one direction, or if we see the momentum on the Republican side, I might even change it to tilt, or even tilt Republican. Of course, it would take a lot for me to flip it over, but it's very possible. Next, we're going to move on down to the state of Nevada. Again, I'm a broken record when it comes to this point, but Nevada was the only swing state in 2016 that voted for Hillary that got more Republican in the 2020 election. It was by a very, very slightly amount, like 0.1%, but it did get more red. And I think that's extremely important, especially when you're talking about a midterm where Republicans are expected to have a turnout gap. They're going to have an enthusiasm gap with the Democrats. They're going to be more excited, more energized to turn out. And I think in a state like Nevada, a state where Donald Trump only lost by less than 3 points, you certainly could see a flip on the gubernatorial level here. It looks like the former Senator Dean Heller is not going to be the Republican nominee as of right now. It looks like Joe Lombardo, who is a sheriff, I believe the Clark County sheriff, is likely to be the gubernatorial nominee. And also, Dean Heller doesn't really have any major endorsements. Joe Lombardo, he only really has the Nevada Police Union. Well, I guess none of the other candidates really do either. I must have misread that. But either way, I think this race is probably going to end up being a flip. Steve Sisolak is not an incredibly popular governor. Nevada is a swing state still, even though it has voted with the Democrats consistently the last couple of presidential cycles. It's been getting closer and closer ever since 2008 to the point where now 2020 is the closest it's been in, you know, over a decade, you know. So, you know, since 2004, this is probably the closest it's been for the Republicans. So I think as of right now, I think on the governor's race, I'm probably going to put it as a tilt Republican. Just for now, obviously this could change, but I think, you know, some people are, I notice a lot of pollsters are definitely less willing to make this a tilt Republican as of right now. I'm pretty comfortable with that prediction. I think given the momentum, given the fact that Joe Biden is not popular, Republicans are energized to vote. And, you know, Dean Heller, who probably would have been a weaker nominee, is likely to lose the nomination. I think Republicans have a more than 50% chance to win the governor's race as of right now. Moving on down to Arizona. Arizona is complicated because Kari Lake is a very solid candidate in terms of Republican issues. She's very pro-Trump. She's very in tune with the base. But I feel that she might have trouble appealing to, you know, moderate suburban voters in the general election. That being said, though, Arizona is still a roughly 50-50 state. And when you have a midterm where Republicans are expected to have a turnout advantage, again, Donald Trump only lost the state by 0.3%. You know, this was a super close state. And a lot of people say, well, you know, Arizona is a state like John McCain and it likes moderates and stuff like that. And that was something I'd once subscribed to. But this really is still a 50-50 state. And I think when you have the Republican turnout advantage, it's going to put Kari Lake over the edge over her Democratic opponent. Katie Hobbs is not exactly that popular. And, you know, the Democratic Party is lining up behind her. You know, she's their biggest name. She's one of their only statewide officials, I believe, besides, you know, on the state level, not federally, of course. I think Kari Lake honestly has a decent shot, and I actually do think, for now, I'm going to put this also in tilt Republican, just because she's going to have trouble reaching out to centrist independent voters and moderates, but I think given the kind of year 2020 is expected to be, I think it'll be just enough to put her over the top. Again, Arizona does like to elect Republican governors. Doug Ducey, who was relatively popular back in 2018, won by a landslide margin in a year where Democrats were doing really well around the country, similar to Greg Abbott, funny enough. Kind of in the Southwest, you saw that the Republican incumbents did better than a lot of others around the country. Moving on to Colorado. Colorado is a state where I think Democrats are going to do better than they will in other parts of the country. Colorado used to be a swing state, not so much anymore. It's more akin to Oregon, kind of, in the sense that it's a safe blue state, but statewide races could possibly be competitive. I think Jared Polis is in a pretty comfortable position to win re-election. Back in 2018, he won his last election by about 11 points or so. Again, this was during a blue wave year. He's a relatively popular governor, and he's one of the only Democratic governors that had a much more moderate approach to the COVID pandemic than others around the country. And 2022 is certainly a year where a lot of Republicans are going to strike back with a vengeance against those policies which they so vehemently disagreed with. And I think Jared Polis might be spared from some of that wrath where other incumbent governors, you know, maybe like in Wisconsin, Nevada, you know, around the country, they're not going to have that same sort of leniency among voters. So I think Jared Polis, again, he's a popular governor. He has high marks for a lot of his policies across the state. And I think ultimately he will win by less than he did in 2018. But I definitely think a 6 or 7 point margin is probably what we're going to see in Colorado on the gubernatorial level. And I think that's very good considering the kind of year we're going to see around the country with other Democrats. And probably better than what we're going to see in New Mexico. Now, New Mexico, I want to make a video on that on its own, and I might even make that tomorrow, honestly. I'll put that out tomorrow. But New Mexico is a state where I think could be a sleeper for the Republicans. I think the Republicans might actually be able to win the governor's race here. And, you know, I was right about New Mexico last time around in 2020. In 2020, I said that New Mexico's Senate race would be down to single digits, you know, a 6 to 7 point margin. And I was actually correct on that front. Ben Ray Lujan, who was a non-incumbent, only won his Senate race by about 7 points, 6 or 7 points against Mark Ronchetti, the Republican, got 45.6% of the vote and overperformed Trump by about 2 points around the entire state, and Ben Ray Lujan underperformed Biden by about 3. So this race actually got really close, and I was one of the few people that actually said that this wasn't going to be a safe race for the Democrats. It ended up being a likely margin. So I think Mike Ronchetti being the likely Republican nominee in this gubernatorial race, I actually think he has a decent shot of beating Michelle Lujan Grisham. Now, that sounds pretty far-fetched given the fact that in 2018, she won by a landslide margin, but you have to understand that not only was this a blue wave year, but Steve Pearce really only had appeal in the southern portion of the state, his congressional district, which he underperformed. He'd run for statewide office before. He'd never really done too well. And also, Susana Martinez, the former Republican governor, then incumbent, was incredibly unpopular. You know, her approval rating was in the low 30s, things like that. So she was a super unpopular governor. This was just a backlash year election, I think. I think this year it's going to be a lot closer. As of right now, I'm still going to give Michelle Lujan Grisham the benefit of the doubt, given that New Mexico is still a blue state. But I would not be surprised if this categorization becomes even closer as we get closer to the midterms, because I think New Mexico is one of those states that could end up being a sleeper for the Republican Party. They might actually end up pulling up an upset here where they don't really expect it. Moving on to the state of Kansas, Laura Kelly, the incumbent governor, we don't really have a lot of polling on her. She's not exactly unpopular either. In fact, her latest approval ratings weren't terrible. I think her approval rating was in the low 50s, which for a Democrat in Kansas is really well. The only thing really working against her is that she's a Democrat in a blue state who is not really a so-called dino. She obviously is more moderate on her positions, but she's not somebody, who really is a right-wing Democrat. Somebody like John Bel Edwards, for example, who's a social conservative and a fiscally conservative Democrat too. He's a conservative Democrat, which is one of the reasons why he was able to win. Laura Kelly really just had everything going for her, though. She was running against a very, very, very controversial Republican nominee in Chris Kobach, who turned off a lot of moderate voters across the state. It also was a blue wave year, coupled with the fact that you had independent Greg Orman taking up about 6.5% of the vote. All of these factors together led to a perfect storm where you had Laura Kelly actually winning the governorship. And this is one of those rare examples. This could happen. I predict this may happen to one of the blue states, whether it's Oregon or something like that, where you're going to see a situation where an unlikely Republican might end up actually winning a statewide office. And I don't know which state that's going to be yet. I don't even think it's fair to categorize Oregon as a state. I think you're going to have a safe blue state elect a Republican governor in 2022. That's one of my more bold predictions, and it won't be California, I'll say that. So, it could be Connecticut, potentially Rhode Island, and very, very, very unlikely, but at this point I don't think totally impossible, the state of New York. Of course, in New York, you literally have to have a third party, like somebody like Cuomo, gobble up like 12% of the vote for that to happen. But again, in Kansas, I think Laura Kelly is likely to lose, and I think it's going to be by a pretty significant margin, too. It might be in single digits, but I think it'll be a likely margin. It's not the fact that she's unpopular, it's just going to be the environment that she's running in. Kansas is a pretty red state. If we go down the list, she won her race by 5 points, but all the other Republicans, nearly 20 points for the Attorney General. Treasurer, like 18 points. This race, Secretary of State, was one of the really only close ones, and even then, still went by 9, again, in a really good year for Democrats, so I think it's likely that Laura Kelly will lose. It's not impossible for her to win, but right now, again, we saw this in Alabama, too. A lot of people thought Doug Jones was only going to lose by a lean margin. I said for a while he was going to lose by a safe margin, and I was proven right, because a lot of times when Democrats win in those rare circumstances in very red states, they tend to get voted out, even if they're relatively popular. Moving on down to Texas. Texas, I not necessarily have gray because it's not safe, but I do want to talk about it a bit because the polling in Texas has the race a lot closer than I expect it to be. It really only has Greg Abbott up by an average of 7 points, basically 8 points. Now, ultimately, I think it's going to be a more lopsided margin of this. I would be surprised if Greg Abbott won by anything less than 12, given the kind of environment. Last time around in 2018, granted, Abbott was more popular, but he won by a 13-point margin, in a year that was pretty poor for the Republicans, and especially in Texas, where honestly Texas was on the verge of electing Beto O'Rourke. Beto only lost by less than 3 percentage points, and meanwhile you have Abbott winning by 13. So I certainly think that's a testament to Abbott's strength among suburban moderate voters, where he was able to really win a huge percentage of those. Also, he won 40% of Hispanics in a blue wave year. Imagine what he'd be able to win in 2022. Now, Abbott saw a dip in popularity for a number of reasons, mainly due to the severe winter storms that Texas saw early last year, which really hurt him, although I think he's going to rebound. And I think the more Texas voters see of Beto O'Rourke, the more they're probably not going to want to vote for him, especially given how much of a red wave year 2020 is expected to be. Even if it's only a mildly advantageous year for Republicans, I still think Abbott will win by a safe margin, so that's not going to change. Moving on up to Minnesota. Minnesota was once a state I think Republicans thought they really had a shot in. They thought it was similar to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, but I think Minnesota is an entirely different beast in and of itself. Now, Minnesota hasn't elected a Republican governor since 2006, and if we go back to the 2018 elections, Governor Tim Walz won by about 11 points, over 11 points. So, again, I think this is a testament to just how blue Minnesota actually is. Though margins can get close, I think Minnesota is still reliably Democratic. Obviously, it's not safe Democratic, but it is a state that reliably votes for the Democratic Party. Now, if we look at some of the polling out of Minnesota, we don't really have a whole lot, although Tim Walz is in a decently comfortable position. There's some polls where he's only up by 3, which could get close. I think as of right now, I think it's safe to say that Minnesota is probably going to be a lean state. It could get closer, although I think a Republican upset here is a little bit less likely since there's no really big name candidates with strong fundraising going up against him. Illinois, I've been putting as likely for a while. I still stand by that. Illinois is a state that tends to be a lot closer when it comes to statewide elections and off-year races, mainly because turnout in the Chicago area is always a lot lower. Turnout in southern Illinois is higher. J.B. Pritzker defeated Republican incumbent Bruce Rauner by a pretty comfortable margin back in 2018, although J.B. Pritzker, I believe, his approval rating has probably fallen since then, and of course, you're going to be dealing with a hostile environment toward Democratic incumbents. Illinois is a safe state on the presidential level. It consistently votes for Democrats by over 15 points. I mean, my categorization is safe by 12, but, routinely you see Democrats winning 15, 16, in some cases over 17 points over the Republicans. Not much to talk about here. There'll probably be more updates in Illinois as the election season goes on, but right now I'm going to put this as a likely state. Wisconsin was one of the closest races back in 2020. Joe Biden only won the state by 0.6%. And the incumbent governor, Tony Evers, only won his election by 1.1% against a Republican incumbent in a blue wave year. And I think that's a testament to how Wisconsin in recent years has become less elastic when it comes to off-year races. It's more sort of in the center. And though Tammy Baldwin won by a pretty sizable margin, I think Tony Evers will likely be in trouble come 2022. And for a number of reasons. One being, of course, that Wisconsin was one of the closest states in 2020. I think it's very unlikely that we see a situation in which Tony Evers does better than he did in 2022, regardless of the Republican nominee. And we also have to factor in the fact that Tony Evers is deadlocked in Wisconsin. The state legislature, both the state House and Senate, are controlled by Republican, maybe super majorities, but if not very, very large majorities at that. Tony Evers has been very ineffective as a governor, not able to get a lot of policies passed, and I think that's another thing that's going to hurt him among independent voters. He hasn't been able to get a lot done, and normally that blame's not going to fall with the legislature. It's going to fall with him as the governor, as the, quote-unquote leader of the state. So I think as of right now, Wisconsin, I think, is even a lean flip. I think it's very likely that Republicans knock off Tony Evers as an incumbent. I'm more confident about that prediction than I am with Nevada, for instance. I think it's more likely that Wisconsin goes than Nevada. Moving on to Michigan, this state I've been you know, kind of originally I had it as a lean Democrat, then I had it as a tilt. But I don't think 2022 is going to be a good year for Gretchen Whitmer and the Democrats. I think if she does win, it's going to be by a very close margin. But as of right now, I think she is more likely to lose based on the national environment. And some of the polls have gotten closer. Originally, Gretchen Whitmer was up by a decent amount. You had some R-rated polls that had it where the Republican James Craig was leading. Again, James Craig is a former Detroit police chief. I think he could have wide appeal among not only white Republican voters, but even some, you know, independents of all races. I think he'll do better to chip away at Democrats' margins there. And of course, the latest poll we have is a Democratic-leaning poll, and it's effectively a tie. I think with Michigan, I'm less confident about this than Wisconsin, but I think Michigan is more likely than not to flip as of right now, end of April 2022. I think James Craig is probably the favorite as of right now. I don't think it's going to be a huge margin, given how much Whitmer won by last time, and the fact that Michigan is more of a, you know, Democratic state than its neighbors, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, I think that the Republicans will prevail in this election. Moving on north, and we're going to head down the eastern seaboard. Maine is another state that I don't think has gotten a whole lot of attention. But I think it could be likely to surprise us in that the Republican Paul LePage, the former two-term governor, could potentially win this state. Now, polling for him is actually not terrible. Janet Mills, though, still maintains a lead by about 5 or 7 points, depending on what poll you look at. But ultimately, I think these polls are going to get closer, and though I think Mills does have the advantage, I think it's going to be very close. I'm going to put this as tilt Democrat as of right now. I think Paul LePage is a pretty strong nominee. He does have the backing from Susan Collins, who will probably go around the state campaigning for him. And again, Janet Mills is not that popular. She's not terribly underwater, but she's a very lackluster incumbent governor when it comes to approval ratings, accomplishments, and I think that's going to hurt her in the state. Moving on down to Connecticut, this really could be a state that could either be very close or not that close at all. Incumbent Governor Ned Lamont did have a pretty sizable approval rating coming off of COVID. Obviously, it's probably tapering off now. You know, a lot of people, ratings are all over the place. You have safe to lean. I've always maintained that this is going to be a lean race. I think it's going to be within 6 points or under 6 points. I'm going to maintain that for now. Obviously, I might move it up to likely. Obviously, the polls are not good right now for the Republican Bob Stefanowski, but I think that over time, they're going to inevitably get closer, and Ned Lamont's going to be in a more vulnerable position. He's going to have to campaign like he did last time a decent amount to win this race. So as of right now, I'm putting it as a lean. Might move it to likely. I'm not as confident about this prediction as I was with other ones. Moving on down to Pennsylvania. This is another state that I think is going to have its own video because Pennsylvania is really, really tough to gauge when it comes to the governor's race. You have a very strong candidate in current Democratic Attorney General Josh Shapiro. And on the Republican side, you have a dumpster fire of a primary. You have no clear frontrunners. I actually have a friend who lives in Pennsylvania who was somebody who wanted to volunteer for Lou Barletta's campaign, and he said it was a total mess. It's in disarray. It's not very organized. And this is really bad news for the Republican Party because Pennsylvania should be a state that they should win easily in the midterms. You're talking about a state that Joe Biden only won by 1.2% back in 2020. You know, and you're talking about a year where Republicans are favored all across the country. Now, Pennsylvania, back in 2014, voted out a Republican incumbent. So Pennsylvania is sort of a weird state in that Democrats tend to do better on the statewide level than they do federally. I also expect that the Senate race, whatever the result is, I think the Republican will outperform the Republican on the gubernatorial level in the Senate race. But this is a super tricky state to gauge. As much as I want to give this state to the Republicans based on the environment, based on the fact that Pennsylvania is a swing state likely to go red in 2022, I'm very up in the air about this race, and I want to give it its own video. Josh Shapiro is a very strong candidate. He's extremely electable. In 2020, he won his re-election for the Attorney General by over 4 points, and we'll look closer at that race when I make a video on it, maybe later this week. He overperformed in 2016, and in 2020, he won Luzerne County, which is a county that went safe for Donald Trump back in 2016, and I'm not sure, he might live in the county. I don't know if this is his home county, but regardless, Pennsylvania has a long streak of voting for Democrats to statewide positions over Republicans the last 50 years. This is really tough. As of right now, I might even put it as a tilt Democrat. Now, that's a very controversial opinion, and it's likely to change. But as of right now, based on what I'm seeing with the primary, what I'm seeing on the Democratic side, I think the Democrats have a slight advantage in this governor's race, and that's why I'm putting it as tilt. This isn't necessarily what I think will happen in November. But I think as of right now, if the election were held today, I think the Democrat would have a slight advantage, and that could very well change. I'm going to be making my own video, its own video on this race and New Mexico, because I think these are two governor's races that are going to be super interesting. Obviously, I'm going to cover all of the non-safe governor's races at some point individually, but these two especially I want to get to really soon because I have a lot to say on both of these races that I can't really fit in this video. Moving on down south to the state of Georgia, this race, the rating will change depending on who the Republican nominee is. If Kemp is the nominee, I'm probably going to put the Georgia governor's race in safe, in lean, possibly even a lower likely margin, but I'd have to see a lot more evidence to make a call like that. As of right now, I think Georgia is lean Republican. I think Perdue is likely to win. Kemp is likely to win. I think Perdue is likely to lose the nomination. And I think for Republicans, that is good in terms of electability. Perdue is not as electable as Brian Kemp, according to the polling. In fact, there's one Republican-leaning poll where Stacey Abrams is winning. And in that same poll, Brian Kemp is beating Stacey Abrams by 6 points. So it's clear to me that David Perdue is the weaker nominee of the Republicans. I'm not saying he can't win. I think he still would win. He's still leading Stacey Abrams in the aggregate by over 3. Plus, given the environment that we're expected to see, I think is likely to go for the Republicans. But I think there certainly is a weak spot for the Republicans if they nominate David Perdue. He just was fresh off losing a Senate election early last year. I don't think he's an incredibly strong nominee. If you're a Republican in Georgia, I highly recommend you watch the Republican primary debate. I saw it yesterday, and honestly, in my opinion, Brian Kemp came off as much more prepared and a stronger candidate. I'm not saying that off of any policy bias or anything. I'm just saying if I were to look at it independently, I think Brian Kemp came off better than David Perdue in that debate. So I think he's ultimately a stronger Republican nominee, and I think he's likely to win by about 5 points or so right now. Now we go on down to Florida. Florida does not seem to be having a lot of competitive races come the 2022 midterms. Marco Rubio is in an extremely strong position on the Senate level, and on the governor's level, DeSantis is in a pretty good position as well. A lot of people have changed their ratings to likely Republican. I think that's fair to say. Even against the strongest Democratic nominee, Charlie Crist, he's still leading him by over 8 points. Almost 9 percentage points. And Nikki Fried, forget about it. He's winning by a safe margin. But given that Charlie Crist is likely to be the Democratic nominee, I still think DeSantis will probably win this by a likely margin. So between 6 to 12 points. That's still my characterization of Florida at this current time. I think he's going to overperform in places like Miami-Dade County. I think Marco Rubio even has a shot to win Miami-Dade County, honestly. It's a county that went to 22 points to the right where it was back in 2016. Donald Trump got 46% of the vote in it. I think DeSantis and Marco Rubio are probably only likely to overperform, given the fact that Republicans have improved with Cuban and Hispanic voters since 2016 rather, and that this is going to be a year where Republican Hispanics are going to turn out at a higher number than Democratic Hispanics relative to the state. So I think ultimately you're going to see a likely result out of Florida. Now, this is what I have so far. This would put the country at 30 Republican governors to 20 Democratic governors. Again, there's some states like Michigan, PA, Connecticut, Maine. These are states that I'm not as confident about because there's a lot more up in the air. But these other predictions I'm pretty confident about, at least if the election were held today. So anyway, guys, I definitely made some more controversial calls this video. Please leave your thoughts down below if you disagree or if you agree with the predictions I've laid out in this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.